Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to a very timely seminar, Resilience in Evaluation, Navigating Systemic Shocks with Dr. Michael Quinn Patton. At a time when global systems face unprecedented challenges, building resilience into our evaluation practice has never been more crucial. I'm Marini Sanka, the New Zealand convener of the Australian Evaluation Society. Before we begin, I'd acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands in which we join from today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to the leaders from all the nations represented in this seminar. This seminar is recorded and it will be uploaded into the AES YouTube channel in about 2 to 3 weeks, so do keep an eye out for that. Just to note to please keep your mics on mute and type your questions into the chat. We will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Dr. Michael Quinn Patton needs no introduction, but before I introduce him, I'll start us off with a short karakia, as is the custom in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Ko te timatanga, o te rā, ko te ore ore. Ko te timatanga, o te ore ore, ko te mohio. Ko te timatanga, o te mohio, ko te marama. Ko te timatanga, o te marama, ko te mahi. Ko te timatanga, o te mahi, ka maua. Kia whakamaua. Kia tina. Humie, huie, taikie. This karakia very appropriately translates to, at the beginning of the day, there is movement. At the beginning of the movement, there is knowing. At the beginning of the knowing, there's understanding. At the beginning of the understanding, there's doing. At the beginning of the doing is the practice. Grasp firmly. Let it be heard. Let it be discussed. So it is. Today, we are so honored to welcome Dr. Michael Quinn Patton, who has transformed the global evaluation landscape with his innovative approaches, including utilization-focused evaluation, developmental evaluation, and principles-focused evaluation, all designed to make evaluations more practical, adaptive, and meaningful. A former president of the American Evaluation Association, he is the founder of Blue Marble Evaluation, focusing on global systems change. Over his extensive career, Dr. Patton has worked with governments, NGOs, and international organizations across the world, helping to reshape how evaluations are designed and used in complex real-world settings. A recipient of several prestigious awards, his work continues to inspire the field of evaluation, bringing rigorous methods with deep relevance and meaningful change. Please join me in warmly welcoming Michael. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be with you and to ruminate and meditate with you today in this busy time about the nature of resilience. And so to help bring you into this space, I'm going to get us started with a bit of a meditation on resilience from a singing group who recorded a song called Resilient. The lyrics are, I am resilient, I trust the movement, I negate the chaos, uplift the negative, I'll show up at the table again and again and again, I'll close my mouth and learn to listen. These times are poignant, the winds have shifted, it's all we can do to stay uplifted, pipelines through backyards, wolves howling out the front. Yeah, I got my crew, but truth is what I want. And here they are to move into this space, little music.
I am resilient. I trust the movement. I negate the chaos. uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to listen. Oh, 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 These times are poignant, the winds have shifted. It's all we can do to stay uplifted. Pipelines through backyards, wolves howling out front. Yeah, I got my crew, but truth is what I want. Realignment on point, power to the peaceful, prayers to the water, women at the center, all vessels open to give and receive. Let's see the system brought down to its knees. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Were you all able to see that?
Michael, we heard the audio, but we didn't see
I
the.
forgot to do the sharing. Sorry. You missed the dancing. Maybe we'll get back to it. All right. Sorry about that. So I come to you late in life and find that old age is like climbing a mountain. You get out of breath and tired, but the view looking back can be spectacular. And as I have been at this now almost 60 years, I find that our field keeps growing and developing, and the issues that we face are both consistent and new. And so this is a chance for us to ruminate some on the challenges of being resilient in dynamic times, and learning about that together and from each other, and especially from indigenous cultures around the world who have exemplified and excelled at being resilient, which is why they are still with us and teaching us about the nature of that. So I invite you to think about what mental images come to mind when you hear the word resilient. One of the sites that provides stock photos has these photos as images of resilience. None of which I think quite captures it. That to me is an adaptation. That's persistence and determination. That's flexibility. Resilience has to do with absorbing a shock and being able to come through it. There are levels of resistance: individual, family, program, organization, community, ecosystem, global. And what we're going to explore is what it means to treat resilience as an evaluation criterion, something that we help define, that we watch for, that we help build the capacity of, both for the people we work with, but evaluation itself is absorbing shocks, is under attack. And so how can we nurture our own resilience? The term comes out of ecosystem studies, where resilience is defined as the magnitude of disturbance that can be absorbed without fundamentally altering the system experiencing the disturbance. Not that it's not changed, but it's not fundamentally altered, that the core is there. Thus, resilience can be thought of as a capacity to experience a significant shock, adapt as needed, yet still maintain the integrity of the original entity. The cultural core, the ethical core, the practical core. The Resilience Alliance, which is a a global network of people working on resilience as an approach to development, say that the capacity of a socio-ecological system to absorb or withstand perturbations and other stressors such that the system remains within the same regime, essentially maintaining its structure and functions. It describes the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization, learning, and adaptation. And they've identified a set of resilience principles. Theoretical advances in recent years include a set of 7 principles that have been identified for building resilience and sustaining ecosystem services in socioeconomic systems. So from a principles-focused evaluation perspective, the questions around these principles is whether they're present and meaningful for any given system at any level, from individual to global, whether they're being adhered to, and what the results of following them are. And we'll return to these principles. I'm going to go over them now, but invite you to think about what they mean both in your work, whatever level you're working as an evaluator, but applying them to our profession. Maintaining diversity and redundancy. Redundancy means, in this case, being able to back up, not being fragile and totally dependent upon one way of doing something. Managing connectivity, interrelationships, managing slow variables and feedbacks as things change, fostering complex adaptive system thinking, encouraging learning, broadening participation, and promoting polycentric governance, multiple voices engaged. That these are characteristics of what the Resilience Alliance is finding are principles for supporting resilience, and therefore they become potential strategies for programs, for communities, and for evaluation criteria. At the individual level, research on individual level resilience aims at identifying characteristics of people who we experience as being able to come back from great difficulties, tragedies, illnesses, financial shocks in some cases. And the big question is why the variations in resilience. When people experience a trauma, a crushed by a boulder, some people rise up, some people are crushed by the shocks that they experience. Others rise up and push that trouble away, and are resilient, are triumphant. And there's a lot of research about trying to identify what the characteristics are of variations in resilience. Early in my career, I worked with a set of youth programs and youth research. The University of Minnesota, I'm based in Minnesota, had a Youth Studies Institute that had its primary focus on youth resilience and identified at a minimum specifications level 3 core factors that they found supported youth resilience: that a young person had something they were good at, something they felt good about themselves because they could do something well. They had a close, trustworthy peer, and they had an affirming, meaningful adult relationship. And so the youth programs were aimed at both assessing the extent to which young people had those 3 things and community support for creating those kind of things. Again, thinking about the characteristics of resilience for evaluators, we could translate that into having an approach to evaluation that you feel confident in, that you know, that you are able to do well with, having a close, trustworthy peer, and an affirming, meaningful adult relationship with someone who's able to support you. And the challenge is not just to look at the averages in these issues, but to document and understand variations, and to appreciate and better understand the things that support resilience and the barriers to resilience at all these different levels. Vinod Thomas was the former director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the World Bank, became director of the Asian Development Bank, and is now teaching in the Philippines. He's just come out with a book called Risk and Resilience in the Era of Climate Change, about resilience as an evaluation criterion. And part of what's interesting is a number of writings now that are focusing on this from a policy, a programming, and now evaluation perspective. Judith Rodin was the former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and as she left that position, she's now a professor. She wrote a book called The Resilience Dividend, being strong in a world where things go wrong. Rob Vandenberg, one of the founders and a former president of the International Development Evaluation Association and in South Africa, has come out with a book called Evidence for Hope that subtitled The Emerging Sustainability Revolution, which focuses upon the capacity building promise of resilience as both a programmatic criterion and an evaluation criterion. And a lot of books examining the nature of resilience, the power of resilience, the science of mastering life's greatest challenges, hard-won wisdom for living a better life. Most of these directed at individuals rather than programs and projects. What brings me to this has been the work that I began a decade ago looking at failure and how we communicate with programs that are struggling, how we deal with failure ourselves, and beginning with the Blue Marble evaluation work to look at systems transformation criteria. Now, this is all made immediately relevant by the devastation and destruction of the Trump administration, which I'll share some perspectives on, and the implications for resilience, and the larger climate change, ecosystem, Blue Marble, and Earth Day dimensions of this. So we're going to come at it fairly quickly from several different directions. In 2015, which was the year that the SDGs were adopted, the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations also declared that the International Year of Evaluation. Stuart Donaldson was the president, and he chose as a theme exemplary evaluations in a multicultural world. And I said to Stuart, Stuart is a professor of positive psychology, very much into appreciative inquiry. And so this theme, exemplary evaluations, was very much in keeping with his positive outlook. And I said to him, Stuart, you're going to have over 1,000 sessions at AEA. For a little balance, don't you think we ought to have one of them that focuses on failure? So we began a session on evaluation failures. Two aspects of learning from failure, important for evaluators: facilitating learning from failure among the stakeholders we work with, and walking the talk of learning from failure by doing it ourselves. Stephanie Evergreen joined me in that first session. Patricia Rogers was one of our colleagues from Australia who participated in that first session in 2015. And we continued doing a session every year until COVID hit and the AEA didn't meet. But those sessions on people sharing their experiences of evaluation failures always had a packed house, 200 or 300 people participating in those sessions, and sharing in small groups, presentations that we began with, and finding it important as part of resilience to be able to acknowledge evaluation failures and get support from others who are also experiencing challenges. And where that those 5 years of looking at failure and subsequent work on this led me to come to sense that evaluators, as evaluators, we are in the overcoming failure business. Enhancing resilience capacity then ought to be a prime part of what we do, not just helping people overcome particular failures, but the capacity to deal with failures, both large and small, it turns out not to be that easy. In many ways, the field of evaluation exists because of failure. Failure is widespread and common, and it's highly emotional for people. The foundations of failure and evaluation: if there's no failures, there's no need for evaluation. If there's no fear of failure, there's no need for a positive psychology of evaluation or appreciative inquiry. If there's no need to improve, there's no need to learn from failure. And so evaluation developments are rooted in and stimulated by failures. And we have dealt with failures as part of how the field has developed. The failure programs to specify clear, specific, and measurable goals led us to develop and facilitate SMART goals. The failure programs to have a coherent program led to logic models and theories of change. Failures of evaluations to be used has led to utilization-focused and other forms of use evaluation. The theory of change work has led to looking at success factors. What would success look like? How will success be achieved? And part of what I've come to is that we need to match a theory of change with a theory of failure. Theories of change essentially carry a positive bias, a positive perspective. How do you bring about change? A corresponding shadow side is what are the barriers to change? Failure factors. What could go wrong? What might interfere with achieving success? And making those inquiries part of the theory of change development process as a way of building resilience, which includes the capacity to anticipate shocks, anticipate what can go wrong, and to be prepared for it. So when the way that I came to invite Stephanie to be my partner in these failure sessions is I did a presentation at a major colloquium on theory practice connections that Stephanie was in the audience, and Stephanie came up to me afterwards. I hadn't met her before. This was 20 years ago. And she said, "Michael Patton, you just showed the worst slide in PowerPoint I have ever seen." And I said, "Wow, that must be quite a compliment, because I know you see a lot of slides. Would you like to see the slide that Stephanie dubbed the worst PowerPoint slide she had ever seen?" Here it is. What I was using that slide to show was how muddled our brains are with deduction, induction, abduction, cognitive processes, emotional processes, evaluative thinking, all that stuff jumping around. And she said, "That slide's a mess." And I said, "That's the point. That's our brains." She was not convinced. She thought I ought to show a neat formulation of the brain. Kylie Hutchins has done a great book, Editing Evaluation Failures, 22 Classic Mistakes and Ways that Evaluators are Learning from those mistakes. I'm based in Minnesota, where Bob Dylan is from. He's our poet laureate, our songster. And as you know, he won the Nobel Prize in 2016. And hopefully some of you have seen the movie that has come out about Bob Dylan, called A Complete Unknown, starring Timothy Chalamet. So hard to face and cope with. Why does it require resilience? Daniel Kahneman, also a Nobel Prize winner, him in economics, has documented, along with others, that we as human beings have a strong loss aversion. We fear loss much more than we hope for gain. Losses can be twice as powerful psychologically as gains. And so the positive organizational psychology interventions, dealing with this deal with what they consider a negativity bias. That is our tendency to spotlight things that are going wrong twice as much as we do things that are going well. We remember traumatic experiences more than positive ones. We recall insults more easily than praise. We react more strongly to negative stimuli. We think about negative things more frequently than positive ones. We respond more strongly to negative experiences. Part of building resilience capacity is recognizing our human tendencies. They're going to vary for each of us. Some of you would be deeply in these patterns, others hardly at all. But to know our own patterns of dealing with negative experiences and shocks is part of dealing with our own resilience and being able to support resilience in others. Michael Scriven and Stuart Donaldson did some research on evaluation anxiety and found that the experience of being evaluated, critiqued, or judged commonly results in an emotional reaction of uneasiness, uncertainty, or apprehension. And that they also studied evaluator anxiety. One of Stuart's graduate students, Jessica Ringer and Stuart, studied evaluator anxiety, found that 96% of North American evaluators reporting having experienced anxiety during the evaluation practice, fear that the results of the evaluation would not be used, anxiety about whether findings will be definitive enough to inform action, worrying about whether the evaluator has sufficient competency in the range of methods that may be needed, imposter syndrome, anxiety. And so evaluation appreciative inquiry is part of trying to overcome these evaluations, anxieties, and evaluation-induced trauma. But resilience is acknowledging and having capacities to deal with that. Now, we emphasize a great deal the importance of evaluative thinking, and that's become a major theme of the last decade. But it underestimates, I think, the evaluation is also emotional. And so when we're dealing with resilience, we're dealing with the emotional side of the work. The thinking side, the rationality side, the making sense of things, the logical side, is tempered by the emotional side of what goes on. As this wise instructor tells us,
heeded my words not, did you? Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, but weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher, failure is.
The greatest teacher, failure is. So enhancing resilience is partly, we found in these sessions we did at AEA, building a support network where people can share, bringing failure out of the shadows and learning what works and what doesn't. I'm babysitting a dog with heartworms. Amy Edmondson at the Harvard Business School has been studying errors for 30 years in hospitals, and she said, what I didn't expect to discover was how much variation there is in people's willingness to speak up about mistakes and failures. And when people don't speak up about mistakes, consequential failures are more likely to happen. So part of the challenge for evaluation is to find places where we can openly share both our successes and our failures. And here's where things get tricky for resilience, because it turns out that learning from failure and barriers to failure are substantial. That we have a lot of mythology about learning from failure, but in fact, there's a great deal of evidence that on the whole, people don't really learn from failure. A great many people fail to learn from failure, and that the evidence is that the mythology of learning from failure is greater than the reality of it. And the increasing research about that. For example, a recent study that found that 60%, again in North America, of people who had heart attacks did not make any lifestyle or dietary changes despite knowing that they ought to do that, and other kinds of changes in those regards. And so as we think about how to deal with these changes, I want to take us back to evaluation resilience as a criterion for evaluation. And part of this is in the context, I look back over time, that evaluation has been dominated over the last 60 years by a search for models. Scriven's formative summative distinction is a distinction about finding models that can be scaled. Meta-evaluation is about testing the rigor of evaluation for models, taking models to scale, determining merit and worth. The standard accountability framework is a plan your work, work your plan model, where we ask, are goals clear, specific, and measurable? Was the plan fully and faithfully implemented? Were intended goals achieved? This is really a static model conceptualization of both programming and of evaluation. And it leads then to the dominance in evaluation of evaluations that look at a project or program for 3 to 5 years, determine whether it was successful, make a summative judgment, write a report, and the notion of whether or not those findings and those results will be continued is left up to speculation. So merit and worth as dominant criteria around scaling. Bill and Melinda Gates found that if there's one lesson we've learned about education after 20 years, it's that scaling solutions is difficult. Much of our early work in education seemed to hit a ceiling. Once projects expanded to reach hundreds of thousands of students, we stopped seeing the results we hoped for. And what they've subsequently come to understand is they were scaling high fidelity interventions that did not allow adaptation to context, culture, and situation. And so Scriven's logic of evaluation is to establish criteria, construct standards, measure performance against those standards, synthesize into a judgment of merit or worth. It's a very static, model-oriented, dominant kind of approach, reaching definitive conclusions. Certainly criteria matter. They are central to what we do. I'm not going to read this whole slide, but basically, you know why criteria are so important. And the most widely used criteria are the OECD DAC criteria. They were first formulated in 1991, somewhat revised a couple years ago. And these 6 criteria dominate international development evaluations, starting at the upper right, coherence, how well does the intervention fit? Effectiveness, is the intervention achieving its objectives, going to left counterclockwise? Impact, what difference is the intervention making? Relevance, is the intervention doing the right things? Efficiency, how well are resources used? Sustainability, will the benefits last? Notice these are dichotomous questions. They're static, simplistic, yes-no questions. And the sustainability, what's called the sustainability criterion, is actually a continuity criteria. Will the benefits last? And so these criteria have been picked up by the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, by the Climate Investment Fund, and in the International Development Evaluation Association in 2019, there was a mandate and a draft protocol that looked at the revision of the DAC criteria and found that 98% wanted to keep the effectiveness criterion the way it was. 93% wanted to keep the sustainability criterion the way it was. Australian Simon Nebo has been my go-to cartoonist for some time now, and he did these cartoons and did a cartoon for me showing these traditional criteria as the hurdles that evaluators and programs have to jump over. Alternative criteria are complex systems change, and what I've called here, where resilience fits, is adaptive sustainability. That continuity is not as important as adaptive sustainability. So that the game here for funders and philanthropy, for governments, for international agencies, has been that people make proposals to implement some change, a project, a program, and in their proposals, they have to assert that at the end of the funding period, the results that they attain will be continued. Funders naturally want to see that whatever is accomplished is continued. But that continuation, I'm arguing, is a static way of thinking about results instead of thinking about what comes at the end of a program or a project, the capacity resiliently to adapt to ongoing changes, which we know are going to happen. Indeed, in some ways, the traditional criterion of continuity inhibits change because it holds programs accountable to keep doing the same thing rather than adapting resiliently to change conditions. And so the criterion of sustainability is more appropriately brought an ecological perspective to it, looking at whether resilience capacity is enhanced and the capacity of evaluation then to support that kind of resilience. Now, in that 2015 International Year of Evaluation, when the SDGs were introduced, several of the SDGs are about environmental sustainability, climate action, life below water, life on land, affordable clean energy, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, clean water and sanitation. And as you know, we're way behind on all of the targets for the SDGs aimed at 2030. Ecological resilience interventions are looking at how we engage in either mitigation or adaptation. And what's interesting, I've been talking with several international agency program people and the evaluators who say that they're able to conceptualize and fund mitigation, which means there's some problem that's been created that's going to be reversed. Restore wetland, restore forests, restore coral reefs. That mitigation is restoring things, but adaptation is looking ahead to prevention, to resilience, to anticipating how they're going to react, and that turns out to be hard to fund because they find it is hard to specify what's going to happen, and it's hard to evaluate because our evaluation models require outcomes determined in advance, and adaptation doesn't lend itself to knowing what the outcomes are in advance. Developmental evaluation accompanies adaptation in support of resilience, but they're finding that harder to do. And so most of the international sustainability money is going into mitigation rather than into supporting adaptation and resilience. Which brings me to a suggestion about where we are now with the Trumpian challenges, that because the evaluation mostly funded ends when the program or project ends, and the program and the evaluation speculating on whether or not results will be achieved, that given the widespread attacks on programs that are going on under the Trump administration, wiping out thousands of projects and programs across the federal government and international agencies, stopping the funding of US aid, World Health Organization, World Food Programming, that we ought to be following up now to find out what continues, what ends, what increases. Instead of stopping the evaluation, I've suggested that international agencies, the donors, the philanthropy ought to pick some of the programs that they consider successes and employ and commission evaluators now to follow up to find out what are the effects of the Trump shocks on programs, what adaptations are occurring, what resilience is unfolding, and what kind of creative destruction and innovation is emerging out of these shocks politically, economically, and programmatically around the world. So that this has been, I think, the weak part of our profession is not doing this kind of follow-up. Certainly the press is talking about what the effects are. Programs and organizations are self-reporting, but we need rigorous, credible evaluation to document the effects of the destruction. The bias in our evaluation profession has been in positively documenting positive results, what works, what doesn't work, but not following up to find out how things that have worked are having to adapt and what the characteristics of resilience are. So making those kind of things criteria, sustainability as resilience, equity as another criterion, means that instead of simply the traditional DAC criteria, adaptive sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these values that have been adopted by the American Evaluation Association, by the Australian Evaluation Society, the recognition of indigenous values, the inclusion principle, the importance of relationships, and sustainability. We are stewards of our profession and respect our past, know our story, and nurture a sustainable future through learning, being courageous, and enabling growth, and the corporate responsibility that calls for supporting equity and equality. And so resilience, sustainability, equity, and justice as criteria for us to continue to use to find out how they're being affected up against the things that the Trump is doing. A visionary evaluation for a sustainable and equitable future. The international movement in support of the SDGs, looking at both what's failing, what's succeeding, in the context of our current politics, where facts, evidence, truth, data, and reality thinking are up against post-truth, fake news, alternative facts, make-believe, groupthink, distortions. And on March 4th, 2025, the United States mission to the United Nations, in reaction to a resolution in support of Earth Day in 2025, put out this policy statement. Agenda 2030 and the SDGs advance a program of soft global governance that is inconsistent with U.S. sovereignty and adverse to the rights and interests of Americans. In the last U.S. election, the mandate from the American people was clear. The government of the United States must refocus on the interest of Americans. We must care first and foremost for our own. That is our moral and civic duty. President Trump has set a clear and overdue course correction on gender and climate ideology, which pervade the SDGs. And the statement closes by saying, put simply, globalist endeavors like Agenda 2030 and the SDGs lost at the ballot box. Therefore, the United States rejects and denounces the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Sustainable Development Goals. That's where we are. That's where we need to be able to evaluate the effects of that policy and its long-term distance between the political and the cultural. Let me close with the wisdom of one of our great pioneers, Eleanor Chilinsky, who we lost 4 years ago. Eleanor was one of the pioneers in evaluation. She was the founder of the Evaluation Research Society, former president of the American Evaluation Association. She created GAO, the Government Accountability Office's Program Evaluation and Methodology Division, directed that between 1980 and 1994. They had 80 to 100 people in federal government producing 45 to 50 evaluations at any given time, 30 major products of evaluation annually. Eleanor was the most knowledgeable and experienced national and international evaluator that I knew. She once said that telling the truth to people who may not want to hear it at all is, after all, the chief purpose of evaluation. And in Eleanor's final interview, shortly before she died, she said, if you ask me what was the most important thing we've achieved during the 45 years or so that evaluation and politics have been partners, I'd say you need to look beyond the individual effects we've had on specific policies or programs over time, even though many of these effects have been substantive and consequential. In my judgment, she said, the major accomplishment of evaluation has been the establishment and demonstration of a trustworthy, dependable tool in government for carrying out, and preserving political accountability. So she said, we have to get it right, because if we don't try and don't succeed, and systematic evaluation of what the government is doing becomes a thing of the past, then our failure would affect not only evaluation itself, but also our democracy and its political freedoms. When you come right down to it, we're like canaries in the mine shaft. Our presence means that public accountability is alive and well. But if we go, the nation will have lost a lot more than evaluation. I'll stop it there. And
thank you so much, Michael. You make a sobering reality sound profoundly interesting, and that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So the comments in the chat mostly reflect exactly what you were talking about. We have over 12 minutes for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Michael a question directly. Everyone is agreeing with you in the comment section. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask Michael directly. Michael, I might kick it off. As you pointedly explain, in the current turbulent environment for evaluation, you also explain the role of evaluators to look at what is not working. Do you think this could have been a potential or pitfall in the profession in general, that evaluation has failed to look at failures and be transparent about it, and hence we are in a very vulnerable position?
I appreciate the question, and I think the nuance is that we end up pointing out failures. We end up pointing out what works and what appear to be failures. What we aren't very good about is looking at what factors contribute to the failures and to the successes. But that there's this static kind of reasoning of identifying, even where the factors are identified, they take on a kind of causative simplicity that doesn't lead to what I'm suggesting is attention to the capacity for adaptation. That the failures are often because people have proposed something that they're locked into with funders, that they don't have the accountability, permission to change. So they end up doing something that's not working for 3 years, many times knowing it's not working because that's what they got paid to do. And the process of trying to get permission to adapt what they're doing is so difficult that the very developmental process of expecting failure. I mean, it's in the business world, the mantra is fail often, fail fast, fail forward. But in public sector, everything's supposed to work. And what doesn't work becomes politicized. And that's not at all realistic. So the reason I'm suggesting the criterion of resilience get more play is I'm hoping it's a way to introduce the likelihood that people and programs need to be adaptive, and we expect adaptation rather than it being rare.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. John Gilbert, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. Very thought-provoking presentation. I think when you were talking about adaptive sustainability, I was thinking back to a special issue of New Directions of Evaluation last year, which focused on foresight and futures thinking. And so I was just wondering if you had any comments or thoughts about how that can be integrated into evaluation as a way to perhaps sort of enable one to sort of understand what those likely scenarios are that evaluation can help address.
Yeah, one of the things I've written about, and thank you for the question, John, is that while an evaluation report about what has happened is inherently historical, the moment we do recommendations, we become futurists. Recommendations are inherently future-oriented, but the thing that evaluators are probably least trained in is how to do recommendations. And what the foresight people and the scholarly futurist people say is that when you do scenarios, the least likely scenario is a straightforward projection of the past. Most evaluation recommendations are straightforward projections of the past. They take what's been happening and say, all right, do more of this, watch for this. But in fact, the foresight kind of thinking is not about the actual planning. It falls more into what Dwight Eisenhower, who headed the US troops in World War II and was president in the 50s, often said about planning. He said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Meaning that the process of thinking about what might happen, of asking these questions, what could go wrong? What are we going to track? That when we talk about evaluative thinking, we're talking, I think, really about incorporating foresight kind of work. And the part of what's been missing in that, and I still find missing, is including the emotional content of that work. Futuring is emotional. We're talking about what our kids' lives are going to be like, what our grandkids' lives are going to be like, what we're going to lose, and the possibilities of major disasters. So part of my message is our getting better at not just the thinking side of this, but facilitating, acknowledging the emotional side of what it's like to deal with this stuff.
Thank you, Michael. I think Cara is next, then Martina, and then Graham.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. Just to reiterate all the comments about what a stimulating session it's been. I'm just loving it. I'm so pleased we have it recorded. I'm going to have to go back and listen. I wanted to circle back to your point around learning from failures. And speaking as someone who, so I read that Evaluation Failures book. It is by, if there was one book ever only that you read in evaluation, I would say that is it, because that is the rich ground that you can till to figure out, oh gosh, what do you do when you come up with this situation or this situation? However, trying to get sessions like that at conferences, and I'm talking both from an AES point of view and an ANZIA perspective, can be really challenging because people are worried about sharing their professional stuff-ups. So how did you get those sessions to be so successful? Because I feel that is the missing thing that we have in our conferences.
Well, we did it partly by finding people like myself and Stephanie and Patricia Rogers who begin by sharing our own failures, and that makes it a safer space and more comfortable. Everybody feels like they got pretty good slides after they see my worst slide. And you know, I've got lots of examples of things that have gone badly. And so part of it is that willingness of the people who are looked up to acknowledge their own failures. But then what we did in those sessions was put people in breakout, even though there were 300 or 400, in groups of 3 or 4, to have a few minutes to share with each other. And then within those groups, identify one or two things that people really thought the whole room ought to hear. And they were very moving. I mean, people, once they had shared with colleagues and then were willing, often in tears, and appreciating the opportunity, and people patting them up and thanking them for being willing to do it. So it created a culture of acknowledging that our work is tough. It's important. I think it's noble. I've devoted my life to it. It's been very good to me. And that we need ways of acknowledging that this is hard work. And I agree with you about the Failures book. It's an honest recounting. Those are all thought leaders. They're people being real straight about the difficulties and also their naivete, their not having thought things through. This is tough work, and we need to support each other and find ways to do that at conferences.
Thank you, Michael. Martina, you had one on the chat as well.
Yeah, I thought I would put my hand up, might be the easier way to ask a question. But yeah, thank you, Michael, for such a thought-provoking presentation as well. I work a bit in the disaster recovery space, and one of the outcomes that we're often asked to look at is communities' experience of resilience and community resilience, and how disaster recovery programs might improve community resilience. And I just wondered if you could comment on how some of your thinking might apply to community resilience as an outcome sought by a program, or community resilience in the disaster recovery context, and how the thinking you've described about resilience and the evaluations might apply to that.
So let me do a backwards kind of view of that first. The Vinod Thomas's book on risk and resilience in the era of climate change is arguing that all communities ought to be looking ahead with foresight to building resilience, that humanitarian disasters are going to be everywhere. They're increasing, the severe weather, the political stuff. And so the preparation and being readiness, building social capital is part of looking ahead. And that the one of the things that evaluation can do in the midst of tracking resilience is helping communities recognize what they've done. Sorry about this. Recognizing what they've done, that they can acknowledge and honor the resilience that they've experienced, so that we hold it up for them, and that it's a part of their reflection. It's, in the midst of the humanitarian disaster, it's hard for people to find often positive things, and my experience with that is that in the midst of tragedy, people don't want to be told they're resilient. They want to be able to grieve. They need to be able to deal with suffering. Resilience is what they will demonstrate and be congratulated on down the road. But in the moment, we have to walk side by side with the tragedy. In the book I did with two Canadians called Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, there's a chapter called Cold Heaven. And that chapter is about our experience as evaluators working with program leaders who've dedicated their life to the kind of things you're talking about, dealing with disasters, dealing with poverty, dealing with hunger, dealing with violence, with sexual abuse, with people living with AIDS, never having enough resources. But the directors, the program leaders always have to be up, always have to be on top of their game, people looking to them, and that they found that our being able to talk with them honestly, confidentially about their grief, about their stress, about how hard it was. Cold Heaven is the name of a Yeats poem about despair at the face of disaster, that they often don't have an outlet. And that one of the things developmentally we can do, instead of just judging or naming things, is to be prepared to acknowledge and walk in the pain with people who are doing the kind of work you're describing and don't have anybody recognizing and supporting their grief, not solving it, not fixing it, but being present to how hard it is and how difficult it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Graham, you're next.
Thank you. Again, a very stimulating discussion. One of my other practices is risk management, which I think can often be a good sort of handmaiden for evaluation. And your previous question answered some of what I was saying, which is almost the political misuse of resilience. Sometimes powers that be use resilience as an excuse for saying, well, we're not going to support the disadvantaged. They simply need to become more resilient.
Oh, that's right. I mean, there's a yin yang to all of these things, and in fact, when they become popular, it's what's happened to diversity, inclusion, and equity. Is that they've now turned those words around, and ironically, one of my spiels was now, because those words are actually outlawed now in the federal government. You can't use the word sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion. They're taken out of websites. They're taken out of documents. And what Elon Musk and his folks are talking about is a meritocracy. So my response has been, hey, merit and worth, that's where we started. That's our gig. All right. You don't want to do DEI? We'll do merit and worth. And the question is, who has merit? Who decides merit? Who decides what's worth? Who gets to choose what's worth? We'll do merit and worth if you don't want to do DEI. We got 60 years on merit and worth.